I'm going to talk about my thesis. It's called A New Age of Film Music, Emotional Responses to MIDI Mockups versus Orchestral Recordings. So before I started this process, I did a huge literature review. I wanted to know what made music effective in film. So from what I discovered, music provides 5 things. The first thing is contextualization. So for example, something super normal in a horror movie, like a kid riding a tricycle or someone looking out a window, can be very intense just because the music tells us it's intense, provides us context. Next, it can provide the inner psychology of characters. So like in Pride and Prejudice, characters can be looking at each other, or there's just like a close-up of a hand, and it's like super romantic because the music tells us that they're feeling romantic. And it can also influence our moral judgments. So in the Avengers movie, the same types of violence taken by a villain can be super harrowing, intense, versus like the Avengers theme comes on, they're beating up a bunch of bad guys, and it's awesome violence. It's good violence. And then it can also help us to follow the plot of games or movies. I wanted to bring video games into this because they've been using electronically created music for a really long time. So in the Final Fantasy game, different music plays depending on if you're in a battle or not, or what area of the map you're in. So it helps you to kind of get your bearings and know what's going on in the game. And lastly, it influences our parasocial interactions with characters. So Darth Vader's way cooler because he has awesome music that plays behind him. It helps us to like him, even though he's a villain. Like, he's super cool because of the music. And then here's that on the slide. So how does music influence us? It's through our emotions. So for music to be effective in film, it has to influence our emotions intensely and also influence the correct emotions. So that being said, originally and from the beginning of even operas, music has been created through an orchestra to tell stories. But with the rise of the digital age, that is beginning to change. We use digital means to even record our music sometimes. Those are called MIDI mockups. Generally in the film industry, those are only used to give the director an idea of what the sound sounds like before they send it to an orchestra. It's not usually used as a final version, except for in video games or in smaller projects. So I wanted to know, can these two things be as effective as each other? Do they create the same emotions? Do they create the same intensity of emotions in viewers? So here's a brief history of digitally created music. It started out with these huge computers. That's the first computer that ever created a string quartet. It's the first digitally created music without the help of a person. And then this is the first notation technology. Notation technology is where you put music on a screen, like put notes on a screen and then print it out. That was very inaccessible. With the Macintosh computer, it became much more accessible, but still super expensive. Notation technology, not including inflation, was between $750 and like $1,500. So it was very expensive, and that doesn't even include the cost of the computer. Whereas today, we've got tons of free versions like MuseScore, NoteFlight that people can use to publish their music online for free. And there's also digital audio workstations, which even orchestral composers are using now. It used to mostly be in the pop scene, but you can hear your music in real time. And the music samples are getting so good that it's hard to even tell the difference. You've probably heard some music that isn't a real orchestra and you didn't realize it. But there hasn't really been any research on this topic up to this point. I think, honestly, musicians are a little too scared to ask it. I'm a classical musician, so I was really scared to ask this question. But technology continues to advance, and it is a lot less expensive and more accessible than obviously hiring an entire orchestra to play your music, which could be a great option for small creators. And it also calls into question the demand for classical musicians. So yeah, it needed to be asked. Here are my methods. We're gonna go through them. So first, I had to find a method to test emotions and music. The most scientific one I found was the Geneva Music-Induced Affect Checklist that came out around 2018. And it has 14 categories of emotions that they found were most commonly used to describe how people felt when they listened to music. And then this is the intensity checklist. So they rate how intensely they felt the emotion from not at all to very much. And that's what I used to test each of the pieces I used. Next, I had to pick music. So here are my criteria before I reached out to composers. First, it had to be written by a film composer. It had to sound like film music, but I didn't want to use anything recognizable because that would probably affect my results. And it also had to have a live recording and a MIDI mockup option, which wasn't very difficult to locate because I found a lot of these composers had originally made a MIDI mockup. So I reached out to a few different composers. These two responded to me. It was so nice, and they had projects that they were working on, not in any films or any well-known films yet, that they allowed me to use on my study. So I had 6 recordings total, 3 pieces, 6 recordings, and I didn't want the order that they were played in to be affected, to affect the results. So I did 4 different sessions and played them in 4 different orders, making sure that no recordings of the same piece were next to each other, and making sure that the types of recordings alternated from MIDI to live. Okay, the most stressful part of my study, finding study participants. So at first this poster said want to make an easy $10, and nobody wanted to make an easy $10. So I had 2 people sign up for my study. I hung up posters all around campus and all over Kobo. No one bit. So I reprinted the posters, and a lot more people were interested in $15. So I had 89 people sign up, which was a little bit over my budget actually, but only 65 showed, so it turned out fine. So then I conducted my study. I had a classroom to use with a really nice sound system in the music building. And about 1/3 of my participants were music majors, 1/3 of them had 1 to 4 years or 0 to 4 years of musical training, and 1/3 of them had 4 to 8 years of musical training. So there was a pretty good mix of musical experience, which is what I wanted. My hypothesis was that the 2 recordings would communicate the same categories of emotions, but that the live music would create more emotional intensity. My results. So I was wrong. So as you can see here, my first 2 pieces that I played, and on the bottom you have the 14 categories of emotions. They created the same categories of emotions, and they had almost identical emotional intensity. It'll be a little easier to see in the musical averages right here. So the blue is the live recordings, the red is the MIDI mockups, and from the chart, this is the actual averages right here. There was less than a 1% difference between the 2 intensities. Yeah, my thesis committee was kind of upset. Anyway, so I wondered if that would be different for the music majors, but actually, at least for Cassini, they felt a lot more for the MIDI mockup than the orchestral recording. So anyway, I was upset with that. Just kidding. Okay, so if you doubt my results, which a lot of my friends did, let's do a little test. I'm going to play 2 recordings of Cassini in a random order, and I want you to see which one you think. I'll just play about a minute of each one. that's just the first minute. But by a raise of hands, who thought the first one was the real recording? Okay. And who thought the second one? Okay, so the first one was the real recording. Yeah, it's really hard to tell the difference. Yeah, so to conclude, whoa, I need to find, oh, this is the wrong presentation. Okay, to conclude. So obviously tons more research is needed on this topic with a larger sample size, a more diverse sample size, and I am hoping to do a lot of that research myself in my master's degree. But as far as this study can tell, MIDI mockups have the same capacity for storytelling as live music, which is really good news for a small project. Now, do I think that a blockbuster movie with tons of resources would ever choose that option? No. And I also don't think there's any replacement for live music. But this is an interesting finding, especially as technology gets even better. I think that gap will get even closer. So, are there any questions?